All right, welcome back. We got some BRAP. We're going to continue our conversation about RX7, RX8 rotor housings and using them when you're building a multi-port Renesis hybrid exhaust configuration motor. So to bring everybody up to speed, one of the big reasons we use the GSL-SE rotor housings for our hybrid motor configuration is it's an off-the-shelf item. You can pick up this housing that will bolt right into your Renesis or RX8 motor, allowing for a multi-port exhaust configuration, thereby giving you a Frankenstein motor that has way more exhaust flow and equals up the intake flow a little bit on your Renesis motors, RX8 motors, which really makes it much more applicable for performance application, certain racing applications, hot rod applications, and some people I know want to run it in the RX8. So with some custom fabrication, whether you're boosted or NA, I think this is a great option. But a big question we have always gotten is why not just take the RX8 housing, which has the casting boss in it already for the peripheral exhaust, and why not just take the already existing RX8 housing, bore a hole through there, drill a hole, cut it out, and allow the exhaust out. And it looks on the surface very easy, and I can understand why people assume that. So we're going to cover some reasons why at Mazda Tricks we don't recommend that. It's not necessarily as feasible as it would seem, and it does make sense to just pick up one of the earlier GSL-SE, or if you can acquire them, truck rotor housings from the 13B trucks, that were off-the-shelf Mazda items, and they'll bolt right in. So Mazda Tricks was nice enough to let me borrow one of their early 13B housings. This is not a GSL-SE. I think it's out of an early truck, but the idea is the same. You're just dealing with water O-ring placement. So if you're familiar with RX7s, the early RX7s, early trucks, early rotary engines all came with their water O-rings, basically their head gasket, in the rotor housing. So you've got this O-ring groove cut, and the water O-ring seal will lay in there, thereby sealing not only O-ring to metal, but metal to metal against your side plate, which has no O-ring grooves in it when you're talking about early RX7, early truck, and late model RX8. So water O-ring placement was one of the first reasons we thought to ourselves, well, we can grab and utilize these GSL-SE or early truck, early 13B components in a RX8 motor. And there was really the birth of the idea. We knew that we had parts off the shelf that Mazda makes, that Mazda Tricks carries, that we could put in an RX8 motor to create a custom motor that never existed. And with some measuring, with checking tolerances, looking at exhaust port timing, spark plug timing, we were able to verify that it was a good idea and quickly put that idea into use, which was in our Time Attack and Moto IQ race car, which we do have some videos about, and we'll follow up on that car in the near future, and some more of what that car did. But just so everybody knows, it really came down to, it was an off-the-shelf item, bolted in. You're not dealing with, fabrication or custom work. You don't have to drill any holes. And the GSL-SE rotor housing being still available is actually cheaper off the shelf than a new RX8 housing. So it wouldn't make sense to buy a new RX8 housing and then add machine work to it when you could buy a cheaper housing that will bolt in. So it was not only functionality of O-ring placement, but also a price point difference where we could save money using this GSL-SE rotor housing for a hot rod or custom build. Now there's added expenses because obviously now you're making a custom exhaust. If it's going in a non-rotary car or a hot rod, you've obviously got fabrication involved. If you're going boosted, fabrication involved. But the starting point of being able to buy an off-the-shelf rotor housing and create a custom motor was very enticing, and that led Mazda Tricks and myself as the engine builder at Mazda Tricks to really go after this idea, put it into a race car, and prove its viability. So when you get into looking at the RX8 rotor housing as well, be careful here and not clank things too hard. You'll notice that there's a substantial difference in your actual water passage, your water gallery. A traditional RX7 actually has a full casting for the exhaust to pass through. So even if you were able to do proper machine work, bore a hole through, you'd still lack the sleeving and chambering that is needed for the water to actually go around your exhaust outlet. Obviously, there's a lot of hot air coming out, so Mazda did two things. They surrounded that exhaust port with water, so you've got ample cooling to keep the aluminum from shrinking, warping, or damaging itself. It's a water-cooled passage. And then they also separated the exhaust air, the flame front and exhaust air, from the aluminum by adding their Mazda exhaust sleeve, which we've gotten mixed reviews. I've been told it's Inconel. I've been told it's an Inconel steel blend. I've been told it's high-grade steel. Whatever it is, it takes heat exceptionally well. It's really hard to bend. And if you ever try working with them and welding and bending them, you'll realize that it's not just off-the-shelf stainless. So definitely some high-grade alloy or some type of blend that Mazda used. But the whole idea was heat dispersion, dissipation, and separation from the water cooling gallery. So on top of an expensive rotor housing to start with, even if you had good used ones, typical machine work to do peripheral intake is $500, $700, $800. And that would only get you a hole with an intake sleeve. That wouldn't get you an actual water gallery that's going to hold water and pressure, and an insert for an Inconel sleeve. So not saying that a machinist couldn't do it. I think the reality is a machinist could probably bore an RX8 housing and insert a sleeve and make it functional, but it's not really worth it when we still have Mazda parts off the shelf that we can put into Renesis motors, thereby creating the multi-port exhaust. And then one of the next things would be, why not use a late model RX7 rotor housing like we have here. This is actually, looks like a Turbo 2 rotor housing, very similar to the 3rd gen or any of the 2nd gen rotor housing. Some of the exhaust sleeves change. There's some minor differences in spark plug timing. So always keep them paired up. But we're just going to talk about RX7 mid-model, 2nd gen, 3rd gen, for a moment. And the first thing you'll notice is they do not have the water seal placement. The water seals on these particular motors, your 2nd generation and 3rd generation RX7, were put into the cast iron. And so even though you could machine O-ring grooves in an RX7 rotor housing, again, you're taking an expensive rotor housing and adding machine work to it versus just taking an off-the-shelf component and going right into assembly or right into general RX7 work. So I hope this answers some of the questions as to why at Mazda Tricks and KMR we say, hey, don't bother trying to source RX8 housings or bore holes. Don't try to re-O-ring mid-late model RX7 housings. Just take what Mazda gave us. Take this option for what it is. Very good housing, GSL-SE, early truck. And I think right now the only ones available are the GSL-SE, which would have been in the US 1983, 84, and 85 Mazda RX-7. So a 3-year run, and Mazda still has them in production, and they bolt right into the Renesis. Now, this doesn't mean you can bolt that motor right into your RX-8. Obviously, like I said, there's some exhaust modifications, potential tuning. I've never done a direct drop-in on an RX-8, but I do know in hot rod application, boosted application, the hybrid motors work fantastic, and there's quite a few people running them. So I hope everybody continues to enjoy these technical discussions and an understanding as to why we have done things the way we do them at KMR and Mazda Tricks. So feel free to ask questions, pick some topics. We'll continue the hybrid Renesis discussion as we go, and I'm hoping to have something to put this particular build in soon. So let's keep on brapping. Let's keep everything brapping. Let's enjoy the brap channel. Maybe I'll get some decals made. I'm going to brap on out of here. Thanks for watching. KMR.